Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Wednesday night live stream to continue the conversation about children and permaculture. Last time we were talking about young children in particular and the immersive stage where we just want to kind of have kids out in the natural world with us. And today I've been kind of reflecting on the fact that my daughter became a teenager this past weekend and how in my discussion of immersion, exploration, and reflection, that she's at that age now where we're going to be moving from her time exploring to more of this idea of taking in what it is that she's learned. And how also, I'm thinking about the fact that my son is also not too far behind his sister on this transition as well, as he'll turn 12 this fall, and how quickly it is for us who are parents or guardians or teachers to watch children grow up so quickly, and how as we get older that time seems to pass by a little bit more quickly, and in turn then how to continue to grow what it is we're doing with children as they get older. And last time I had talked about some of those early days together, going out into the yard, first learning how to forage for brambles and berries, picking violets together, and working in gardens and going to nature centers, and because we had access to water, being along the water's edge and taking advantage of that space to meet up with the crawfish and the minnows. And then at our local nature center, the way that they would hold festivals that we could go to and get to interact with all kinds of different people offering environmental education. And in that, the need for, as we're working with children, to provide them with a space of their own when we're out there. And so I was thinking about something that my daughter had put together when she was first gardening, and that was something that was a fairy garden, and how that can be a nice little space to give children a place to work from, where they can create habitat for animals and include things like a toad home by taking a pot and overturning it and resting it on top of some stones for toads and salamanders and other animals to be able to crawl into that space, and have a place that we might take a dish or a saucer that we might put a pot on and put that then in that garden space as well to collect rainwater, and then be a place for small birds to land and use as a microbath, to allow insects to drink from in the summer months, especially if you put a little stone in there for bees or insects to be able to stand on and get access to that water. And just that by doing that then, and giving children an opportunity to take care of a little bit of space, that then we can help them move deeper into our garden over time and take care of larger areas. And from that fairy garden, maybe they start by planting a couple of radishes or fast growing plants in the beginning, using those tops. Maybe we're not necessarily harvesting for food, but just giving them an opportunity to interact with the plants and the seeds and the gardening process. And then using that as a place to explore then as we move into the larger garden, and put paths in, and the way that we might place stones down and create habitat within the garden proper, and use that as an opportunity to talk about how we don't want to leave the ground uncovered, and how that helps to break up rainfall and allow the introduction of water to infiltrate into the soil, as well as then turning those stones over from time to time and using that as an opportunity to explore some of that microfauna that is in our garden space, to look for the roly-polies or the pill bugs, depending on what you call them, to talk about the worms that are there digging through the soil and aerating it and moving nutrients about. And continuing to think about that land care from my children's perspective, I think about something else that my son and I did quite a bit, which was to do trash cleanups one of his things that he actually initiated after a while was for us to go to one of our local parks and just do a trash pickup. And in doing so, the way that we can use that as a conversation to discuss the ethics of permaculture and how what we're doing is an act of earth care by taking this refuse and recycling it, or if it's something that can't be recycled, to dispose of it in the best way that we can. And I always like that as a conversation point because for my son and I, doing that, a lot of times we would collect the plastic and then take it home with us to put in the recycling bin. And that became a conversation then about the importance of taking these items and packing them out. That if we are going to take something with us, having that reusable water bottle that we can use until it's no longer functional, but to bring it with us and to take it home with us every time, and the way that that reduces waste. And, that was a point of conversation for my son and I, was about how much, debris and just kind of stuff gets created and accumulated through our human actions and interactions. And that by picking up in our park, seeing how much just, a couple of families using a regular public space, how much waste they can generate. Very often unintentionally, just by what was left behind or that didn't make it into some kind of a refuse receptacle. Um, and then also, it's a good place to have that conversation and to look for the ways that we can introduce the principles. That idea of immersion within our environmental education for children, that the first principle really to work with is the idea of observing and interacting. And as we start to move into these other stages with children as they get older, that we can begin to build on the various principles as presented by David Holmgren that are kind of like our standard principles to work with. And then over time, something I think I'll get into a bit more during our next live stream for children in permaculture in a few weeks, is about like Bill Mollison's attitudinal principles, things like everything gardens, and the way that we can introduce those beyond just the 12 standard ones that we're kind of used to because of how popular and universal David Holmgren's principles of permaculture have become, to dig a bit deeper into the material to talk about what comes from Bill Mollison and the way that we can use that when talking with children and expanding on these ideas of permaculture and children's education. And just, the different ways that we can look as parents and educators on including the principles of permaculture in our regular conversations, so that they become a framework that, not only are we as designers using to think about the world, but also to bring that back around for children then, so that it becomes part of their regular recurring thought process. And especially as we're building activities for kids, how can we make these like full circle and design activities specifically around each of the principles, and so that we can have the, as I say, so let's start with observation. What are some different ways that we can do observation? And I think about, Wilson Alvarez, who's been on the show several times, who's one of my favorite nature educators. He came to my permaculture design class and had a few exercises that he talked us through about, closing our eyes and putting our hands up to our ears and using that to focus the sound that's coming in, and then turn our heads and noticing what happens as we turn our heads and hear mostly just that noise that's coming in from this cone in front of us. And even as I sit here and do this in my studio space, to record this the way that I can hear my voice reflecting off of the flat surfaces in front of me, and the way that my voice sounds a bit richer and fuller coming back into my ears this way, with just that little bit of delay giving this depth. But the way that we can do something like this when we're out sitting somewhere with our children that we care about, and using this to locate where is that bird up above us or to the sides, or to locate exactly where that insect noise is coming from. and narrow down, um, and focus in on the way that we're perceiving the world, or to kind of take a soft focus with our eyes, which was something else that Wilson taught us, which is where we kind of like try to unfocus on what's directly in front of us and pay attention to this peripheral vision. And the way then, as we focus on that, that what's directly in front of us loses that kind of depth, and we can see more fully like everything around us. Like as I sit here and I pay attention to those sides that have got a light over here and a light here and here, and I can see the full breadth of the bookcases that sit behind my office space against a far wall, and how that changes our immersion in a space. And that, one of my favorite activities to introduce to anyone who is engaged in permaculture is the idea of a sit spot, which is where we find some place, it could be on our front porch or our back porch, someplace or in a local park, someplace where we can kind of observe the world around us, and it's a place that we go to regularly, a couple times a week, and just sit for a little bit. Maybe in the morning, maybe in the evening, change the times that we're out there, and it becomes this regular, recurring observational exercise where we go out and spend time in the world and see the way that it changes regularly from this one particular place. And the way that, listening in like this and closing our eyes, what can we hear? Relaxing our focus, what can we see from that same place over and over again? And, the way that deepens our immersion. And, as adults, we may have lost our connection to some of the natural world. And so if we're going to help children immerse themselves, explore, and then reflect on their time in the outside world, we need to reconnect ourselves as well. And so any of the exercises that I might recommend to you, any of the ideas that we might develop through, live streams like this, conversations on Discord, if we email one another directly and have some one-on-one conversations, that, if we're going to do these activities with children, we should be engaging with them as well. These are experiences that we should have so that it can come from a well of ourselves and our own lived immersed experience. And so it's where like any program that like I develop or present comes from a place where I've personally embodied it, having my own sit spot. Here where I am in the city of Falls Church, that is my balcony for me, because I can look out over some green spaces that we have here. I can see where the chipmunks run, where the squirrels climb, and have this time for regular reflection. And because it is a place that is not difficult to get to, I can go take my morning coffee there before I start my day. If I were commuting to an office, is there a place near my office that I could find, even if it is in the middle of a city, where it's sitting on a city bench or standing on a corner for a little bit, having some place that I can regularly go to before, during, and after my work day, in order to have a little bit of time and space to take in what's going on around me. And there's this meditative exercise that I found on a podcast that I used to listen to probably a decade ago at this point, on meditation, and I wish I could remember the name of the show at this point, but there was this idea that the host raised about, if you think about a blue feather and reflect on that every day, that by calling that to your consciousness and to your attention, sometime in the next week you should find a blue feather. And maybe it might not take the form that you expect, because maybe that doesn't mean that you're going to find a blue jay feather on the ground, but it may be the logo for a company is a blue feather on the spine of a book or on somebody's shirt. That these things that we bring into focus are the things that we find in our lives and around us. And so that's where, even though we might not think of like a city environment as a space where we could engage with or interact with nature, that taking some time to find a space, even in a rich, dense urban environment, we may be surprised by what we find. Um, Nests for birds in a street tree or on the ledge of a building, or as we stand somewhere to see the insects that come through a space. Or maybe we disturb some raccoons in a trash can, depending on where you live and what the variety of animals and fauna are in your area. That just by continuing to live into these practices, what we might find, and then by doing so, the lessons that we can then take from those and share them with the children in our lives. That every moment of our lives can be a teaching moment if we take the time to develop those skills and dig into those spaces. And it's something that, like, if you're not used to it, it can take time to develop something like that and dive into changing that frame of reference and our mindset so that we can use that to expand on the interests and opportunities that are available to children. And that, I've spoke through our first conversations about children and permaculture and environmental education about establishing boundaries and setting boundaries. And that, as we move through exploration, that we can open those up. And that's where I find that as we, as teachers and parents and people who care for children and their connection with nature, that we can show the ways that these opportunities exist everywhere, the more that we engage in these ways. And that we are more likely to spot a chipmunk running along the road and be able to point it out to the children in our lives if we're taking the time to be aware of it. Or I think about a time when there was a town that I used to visit somewhat regularly at odd hours because a friend of mine's work schedule was very strange. But going to their house, recognizing one night that there was a skunk family in town, and you would see, I guess it was the mother skunk being followed by, 3 or 4 babies. And that once I noticed that and the streets that they were commonly on, and experiencing this a couple times, it was easier to find them then. What seemed like this kind of singular or unique experience became something that was more regular and more routine the more that I looked for those animals and that experience. And so, yeah, that's one of those places where, like, our role as educators, it's really important to live into the lessons that we give. And I also think, like, even more broadly, that it's a good note of leadership in the work that we do, that it's important to embody what it is that we do. And even though I know that for many of us, it's not perfect, it's not ideal in many ways because we don't all have access to land. There are lots of restrictions that we may have in our lives that keep us from living into these ideas and ethics as deeply as we might want to. But the more that we can work on bringing our espoused values in line with our governing values, the better off we're going to be and are the people in our lives around us, particularly children, because they're going to pick up on the places that we are deeply and truly engaged and a part of what it is that we are doing. Okay, but yeah, now that I've kind of gone on that tangent for a bit, it's just, yeah, I think, like I say, any place that we can embody what it is we're doing, the more important and authentic it becomes for children or anybody else who we're interacting with as people who are, if we're interested in permaculture, we wind up becoming ambassadors for these ideas. And, it matters. So, yeah. But when it comes to education and immersing children, there was 2 more things that came to mind. The first one of those is The author, David Sobel, he's a great writer on environmental education, and one of his books is Beyond Ecophobia, which I highly recommend. It's all about immersion, really great for elementary aged children, and it's kind of a slim book, something that you could read in, a weekend, but really deals heavily with what we can do to immerse children in the natural world and redevelop many of these connections that are missing the more that we live a more technological and ever deeper connected life. I carry my cell phone everywhere with me. It's this kind of like Star Trek future. And I'm thankful for the times when I've been able to look up plants when I was in the field and determine whether or not something was edible. I think about the first Pennsylvania permaculture convergence at Stonehenge Gardens and standing next to this plant and wondering, is this autumn olive? And being able to look it up and go, oh, this is autumn olive, and being able to pluck some of those berries and eat them there. And even though, ideally when it comes to this information and education of children, many of our conversations should wait until we get back home so that we can experience this world. Being able to take pictures while we're out there and then come back and have a conversation about the plant or bird that we saw and be able to look it up is super important. But what are the ways that we can, deepen connection in a meaningful way in those moments that we have as our lives become, ever busier and we're trying to step back and maybe we only have an hour a week to spend outside in this deep way? What are the ways that we can, I don't want to say improve those experiences, but how can we bring them more in line with our ethics as permaculture practitioners and the moments that we want to share? How can we put all that together? And I think that the work of David Sobel is really important for that. And he's just really good when it comes to breaking these ideas down, even though his books might be seen as a little academic because he does come from the environmental educators arena, but it is pretty accessible, I think. And another one of his books is Place-Based Education, which for me was probably one of the biggest paradigm shifting ideas when it comes to education beyond the basics of environmental education and being in a space and connecting the work that we're doing as teachers to that area. This idea of place-based education is trying to tie the lessons that we're teaching to a place. So if I am doing environmental education and talking about the rise of the environmental movement, because I'm from Pennsylvania and live in the mid-Atlantic, if I want to talk about Rachel Carson, I can talk about the fact that she was born in Pennsylvania, that there's a building in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania that is named after her, the Rachel Carson building, and that also happens to be a place where there are a nesting pair of peregrine falcons. And then being able to tie back the fact that, oh, well, because here's this person who's big on the environmental movement, here are peregrine falcons. Peregrine falcons are a bird species that we can find in Pennsylvania. And then use that as a branching off point of what are other birds that we can find in Pennsylvania, and be able to talk about birds of prey and raptors and, what are the small birds that we're likely to find from our bird feeder, and then be able to talk about the different types of birds and the way that they feed, whether they're ground feeders or whether they'll perch, and why it's important to hang a bird feeder but also to spread bird seed on the ground if we're going to feed for birds, and the way then that we can talk up then about the impacts of feeding birds and both how it's important and can be a detriment depending on the age of the children, and just the way that tying all of that together really then helps to root children into a place. And it's that same idea as I mentioned in our previous conversation about wanting to focus on animals and plants that are in the environment that are around us. And so, being in the mid-Atlantic, this is an area where monarch butterflies come through, that we can create habitat for monarch butterflies and tie our conversation to something that children will see and have an opportunity to interact with, as opposed to, all the charismatic megafauna that we might find somewhere else in the world. I mean, I love polar bears and pandas and koalas and everything else, but the importance of having a conversation about why raccoons matter, why possums are super important, and being one of North America's. I always I don't remember if they're the only marsupial in North America or not. I'll have to go back. I always forget that fact. But that they're also really good at eating insects and have a reputation for helping to clean up ticks. And then again, that idea that everybody's afraid of something, that as we increase our knowledge about what's in an area and what's around us and what we live with every day, that we can remove some of that fear and be able to have informed conversations about the animals that live around us. And then, be able to talk about like the different trophic levels that different animals fill. And then, from there, be able to start having conversations about environmental engagement and reading the landscape, and how, tying back to what I said earlier about a bare section of land and wanting to avoid that. When soil is disturbed, what does that do to show plants that emerge? And using that as, again, as going back to the principles of permaculture, to talk about not having land uncovered. And yeah, as you can see, just the way that we kind of go back to that idea that I mentioned before about loop learning, and how we create these repeatable conversations and are able to tie back to all kinds of things, and how as we create this broad spectrum of lifelong learning, the way we can begin with something as simple as keeping a fairy garden to moving into the broader garden, and then talking about the plants and animals that are in our region, and why it's important to have a garden to feed ourselves, but also to plant extra to feed the other animals that are around us, and to use even a garden as a place for observation to see what animals are attracted to it, and to have different conversations about how we can have animals in those spaces and create habitat. And the other piece that came to mind as I think about my daughter as she gets older is that as we move into that reflective stage in education and being able to kind of synthesize everything that has been learned over the years before, that there's this basic education that occurs in the elementary years that we expand upon through like middle school, and then growing that out then to providing as many opportunities as we can for children to develop and set their own learning standards and their personal agendas, that when we move into reflection, for someone like my daughter who's really into art, being able to continue to encourage her to make art that is steeped in the natural world. When she's painting, to discuss like the colors of a sunrise and how they differ from a sunset, and how can she reflect that in what it is that she's drawing. What birds might she include in a painting, and the way that those shapes vary depending on whether they're something that we might call a burb or a borb or a floof, depending on their shape and cuteness, versus some birds that are taller and leaner, like a blue jay or a woodpecker, or to have something that kind of stalks the ground a bit more, like a turkey vulture, or if you've been fortunate enough to see a bald eagle stand on the ground or walk about for a bit, the way that they've kind of got these hunched shoulders and move about, but they have these very broad wingspans when they're in flight. Or if you've ever seen an owl kind of puff up its wings and make itself very broad as it stands and tries to push something back or to become more intimidating, and the way that a knowledge of those shapes can be useful in art, and to reflect those curves and forms in what it is that she's doing. And because of that interest in art, the importance of keeping a journal, which is something that I recommend for children, for adults, like even at a young age, even if it's just something as simple as having, something like just blank pages to be able to draw on, and express oneself with, to have that box of crayons or colored pencils. And because of that thought of starting from zone 00 in the self and working out, how can we help children to express themselves in a journal? Whether that's, let's color our emotions and express the way that we feel that way, but also to reflect on what it is that we're seeing in the world around us, to write the stories of where they've visited, to really embed these memories in themselves and in the world, and to have them create this record then that extends from whatever age they begin to journal and move forward. And there's a book that I really found useful over the years, and in preparing for this conversation I couldn't find my copy anymore. I don't know if I left it with my daughter, if it's just on another shelf, but there's a book, Keeping a Nature Journal by Claire Walker Leslie. I think I had the first edition, but it's now in the third edition. Been in print for a number of years. Again, Keeping a Nature Journal, Claire Walker Leslie, that I really recommend, because it's kind of a step-by-step process on the way that we can create a journal that reflects our immersion in the natural world and the experiences we're having, and deepen our ability as artists, even if we don't feel like we are much of an artist, to create illustrations that show the world as we've experienced them. Which for me, having studied art for a long time, and even though, from my drawings and things that I might put together for these live streams, it may no longer reflect that I won awards for my art when I was a teenager. But that there's a lot of meaning and value that comes from putting the way we view the world onto paper, and that it doesn't have to be photorealistic. It doesn't have to be, a direct reflection of the world as we see it, but as we experience it. And that, because, as I've said with base maps, in our conversations about permaculture design, our journals can be abstract. Maybe it is about drawing out the way that we're hearing sounds, and maybe we draw something that is like part of a waveform that shows something that is like a sharp sound or a low grumbling, depending on how we interact with the world. As visual as I am and love photography in a way to capture what it is that's around me, my primary way that I experience the world is through my ears. And even as my hearing continues to degrade, did some things that I shouldn't have, listened to some loud concerts without hearing protection, like going through the ways that I experience the world and the way that we can express that in drawings with our words, with these abstract expressions. But also, even though, I like to minimize collecting in the world and like picking up and pocketing and bringing things home, being able to take a leaf and put it in our journal and draw the outline of it, and then perhaps write a description within that leaf, or conform our words to that shape, the way that it again forms our ideas of the world. And there's, I think is it the Sapir-Whorf? Is that the right name, dear?
For what?
There's a linguistics concept about the language that we use.
The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.
Sapir-Whorf?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there's this a general idea, and it's not something it's something I've read about, but I didn't think about until this moment, is this idea of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is about hold on real quick. It was a hypothesis, Sapir-Whorf, Sapir -WHORF. It was a hypothesis first advanced by Edward Sapir in 1929 and developed by Benjamin Whorf, that the structure of language determines a native speaker's perception and categorization of experience. And I would say from my own experiences, anecdotally, feels that way. And so, like, that's where I feel like journaling and getting thoughts, feelings, impressions onto paper are really important. And again, like providing children with a long, like documented experience by starting them with some kind of a journal, even if it's not something that becomes a regular habit, but something that we break out when we get home after having an outdoor nature experience, and just taking 10 or 15 minutes to write something down or reflect on it. When we're working within our home, from that zone 00 or zone 0, to give children a space to think about themselves in the world. When we're working on our garden plans, to have a place for our children to draw out their garden plan for a given year. And then, do that again and again, year after year, and see how that develops over time. And again, to return back to these ideas of the permaculture ethics and express those in that journal and the principles and things like that. So, oh, hey RF, thanks for joining us again. Yeah, I think I've covered everything that I wanted to today, that I kind of had in my outline. I think the next conversation on children and permaculture is going to be 2 or 3 weeks away. I haven't set a date for that, but when we come back to this, I'll do an episode on not David Holmgren, Bill Mollison's attitudinal principles of permaculture, and we'll have a conversation about how we can incorporate those into our conversations about children and connecting with the natural world. From here, the next live stream is going to be next week on Wednesday, June 23rd at 8 p.m. No live stream this weekend. My children are going to be down, so we're going to be spending some time with them, and we're kind of breaking my daughter's birthday into a couple of days, so we're going to have the second of her kind of like 3 birthday celebrations this weekend, and spend some time exploring. But yeah, so we'll be back again and do this again next week. That will be a conversation on permaculture design. Maybe we'll dig into that's going to be a needs and yields assessment. We're going to break down that process to kind of continue building on top of, creating a base map and zones, and then the sector and vector conversation we had this past Sunday for that live stream. But yeah, and then my wife and I are celebrating our first wedding anniversary June 26th and 27th, so there won't be a live stream that weekend. So yeah, probably the next children and permaculture live stream will be the evening of Wednesday, June 30th. And then from there, hopefully I'll have the next 3 or 4 live streams mapped out now that we're kind of getting into summer and have an idea of what that's going to look like. So I'll be able to share all of that with you then. Of course, if you enjoyed this live stream, if you're while you're live with me, or if you catch it on a replay, of course, feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel here. Enjoy the show. Pop over to Patreon, patreon.com/permaculturepodcast. Find out more about what's going on. There's, of course, the podcast itself at thepermaculturepodcast.com. Working on the next series. I've got some individual episodes that'll be coming out here over the next month or so. Another conversation from my co-host David Bilbrey will be out here shortly, as I'm working on the next series, which will be out August and September on urban permaculture and urban agriculture. Sitting down for the second interview for that here next week. Yeah, and of course, if you ever have any questions, feel free to send me an email, show@thepermaculturepodcast.com, or shoot me a phone call, or send me a text at 717-827-6266. And until the next time, I hope you are able to continue to deepen the children in your lives' connection with the natural world, while you all continue to take care of Earth, yourself, and each other.